And we're back. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Biblically Speaking. I'm your host, Cassie Ambolino, and I am so pleased to have a repeat guest, Dr. John Walton. Last time you were on, I got raving reviews, a lot of really positive comments on Instagram with every reel that I posted about you. Everybody loves your work and they're really familiar with it. But thank you so much for coming back on. How are you?
I'm great, and it's good to be back on your show.
Thank you.
Love the conversation.
Me too. It's really easy to learn from you, and I really appreciate your insight from your last visit. I'm really excited to have you back on to talk about Job because I know that you've done a lot of work on Job. What does that work entail exactly?
Well, it started out just by teaching it year after year in an undergrad survey of the Old Testament where I just got to spend one class period on Job. But that got me developing some of my ideas. And then in 2014, I published a full commentary on Job,
Oh,
and
okay.
that helped me to kind of work out in detail all of the things that I wanted to say about the book. But then after that, I did a book with Tremper Longman on how to read Job, which is a small paperback. And that helped us package it a little bit differently. We had just both published commentaries, major commentaries on Job, and we decided to collaborate on this book that would make that information more accessible. And of course, also I got into it as I did the lectures on biblical e-learning and 30 lectures that allowed me to kind of present that material. In the meantime, I've taught week-long courses on Job at numerous places around the world, from China to Australia, and so have enjoyed doing Job that way as well.
I am so glad that you're the one teaching me about Job then, because it's a pretty hard book to get into. I'm not gonna lie. I mean,
It, it
clearly
is.
you wrote a guide on how to read it, but it's difficult. It's a beautiful book when you realize it's poetry, but I think that the defense for God and the vastness of God and what God's capable of and is just, but I'm not gonna lie, as an early Christian, I never read through the book of Job, and it's hard. It's tough.
It is, and part of that comes because people have ideas in their minds. I don't know quite where they come from, but ideas in their minds about what the book is and what it's going to do. And sometimes by the time they get to the end of the book, they say, "Well, that didn't. What's that all about?" You know, so that adds to the
I
complication.
agree. I think that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I think a lot of people go into this thinking Job suffered and it explains why God let him suffer. Am I right in saying that? Is that what
Lots
the
of people think
expectation?
that. Yeah, lots of people think that. I'm not sure that puts us on the right track.
How do you think people typically approach it and why they struggle when they read it?
Well, I think that they expect it to explain suffering to them,
Mm,
explain why people suffer. They
mm.
have that question on their mind. Lots of people have that question on their mind. And they think that the book is going to give them an answer. They think it'll talk to them about a theology of suffering or something of that sort. Um, they think that it might explain to them their own circumstances that they're struggling through. And as I said, they get to the end of the book and they say, not much help. But that's because they were looking for something that the book never intended to do.
Wow, that's really well said because you're hitting the nail on the head that we expect to learn exactly how did he overcome suffering, why did it happen, but it literally doesn't answer anything about why God let him suffer.
Nope.
Interesting. Just a little bit of context. Do you so I like did some background research on Job because again, reading it doesn't help. Like you got to do some external research to kind of get the deeper meanings out of this and have a substantial conversation about it. But with Job, it's set in the land of Uz. Was that a real place, or do you think this is more of like a narrative that was supposed to be representative to the original readers?
Oh, we suspect it is a real place. We just don't know where it is. There's
Okay.
one theory puts it more in the north, like in modern day Syria. The other puts it more
Oh,
further south.
got it.
And uh, we don't know. But
Okay.
yes, it is a real place. It's just one of those places that you use that says far away from here.
got
We use Timbuktu.
it.
Oh,
Got
it's
it.
Timbuktu. There really is a place called Timbuktu, but we use it rhetorically to say
Yeah.
a place not here and pretty far away from here. Yeah. So
Okay, got it. Okay, and it's unknown who wrote Job?
correct. The book never claims an author, and that's not
Interesting.
unusual in the ancient world. The ancient world
Okay.
authorship was not something that was often claimed by anyone,
Oh,
because lots of the things that got written down had circulated orally for so long that whoever initially composed things is long lost and long gone. So
interesting.
in that sense, they typically don't preserve who wrote things.
Okay. So, do you think that Job was a real person, or do you think this was more of a story?
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I think that for me, it's really important that we recognize that it's wisdom literature, and that's not a hard sell to make. I mean, it's dealing with wisdom issues. But as wisdom literature, that's different from telling somebody's story. It's kind of telling a broader story about humanity. And in that regard, it doesn't really matter whether he's a real person or not. I tend to find a middle position and say this is probably a guy whose story had circulated all around, and he really was somebody who was considered righteous and suffered a lot. But the whole book, even if it has that kernel of background in it, really goes its own way to develop all of that. And so,
Yeah,
to that extent, I think that it's it's reasonable to think Job was a real person, but this is a story that's written in a wisdom tradition that expands quite imaginatively about things. So I don't think its point is to say, and take it to the bank, this really happened.
right, right. We're not here to study Job as a person.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So, like, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the original readers, and like hearing a story like this, it sounds like it was something that was just like a common story. A lot of people knew it, perhaps. But was the topic of suffering, was it kind of like a virtue to be discussed? Was it a common topic for I want to say for the Israelites? Like,
Yeah.
what kind of impact did this story have that it made it into the Bible? It must have been a big deal.
Well, as we might expect, suffering has always been a big topic in human conversation, and the ancient world is no surprise. We have pieces from Egypt, from Babylon, from the area just north of Israel, all of these places that have pieces about suffering that try to explore the topic. And you can look at all of those, and they give different kinds of answers, and they have different kinds of issues, but the topic is clear enough. Besides actual literary pieces, just the topic of the retribution principle. The retribution principle is righteous people should prosper, wicked people should suffer. And not just should, but they do. That's how it works. It's how the system is supposed to work. And, retribution principle is very common in Israelite literature, whether it's Psalms or Proverbs or Ecclesiastes or Job. And the retribution principle is also evident in ancient Near Eastern study. It's a little bit
Yeah,
different there because instead of talking about righteous and wicked, they'll talk about someone who's in favor with the gods or someone who's out of favor with the gods. So it
yeah.
takes a little bit different twist because of the systems. But this is a common topic for discussion, and it's no surprise because people have always struggled with suffering.
Right, right. By retribution principle, you kind of talking about like karma in a sense.
Yeah, karma is one reflection of retribution principle. Goes around,
Yeah,
comes around, and yeah. Mhm.
yeah. And I think that the characters, the friends in this book, really defend that to the death. Really
Oh
saying
yes, they
that
do.
you must have done something bad for something this bad to happen to you.
Right. It's clearly fundamental in their thinking.
Okay, well, I know that you've done a lot of work on Job, and I have a lot of questions. So, do you mind just laying the groundwork for why do you think good people suffer? And, is that the right headspace to approach this book with? Because I feel like that's the most obvious question in Job is kind of this karmic principle of like, why did this happen to Job if he technically wasn't a bad guy? It says right at the beginning, he's blameless. So, why did God allow this? Should we focus on that, or what's the approach? Teach me.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I don't think the book is meant to answer that question. Why do people suffer? Well, it's because of the world we live in. And the world is the way it is because God has made it the way that it is. And therefore, that means that suffering is possible. One of the things that the book does want to make a point about is that it's reductionistic for people to think that the system is so simple. The retribution principle. Here it is. This is a piece of cake. Righteous people prosper, wicked people suffer. Boom, all taken care of. Simple system, simple equation. And God's basic throughout the book, he's saying there's nothing simple about that equation, and it doesn't work that way. And
Yep.
you're really misconstruing the world and God and your situation by trying to squeeze everything into that equation. So
Yes,
to
this
that
reminds me of
extent,
our last conversation when we talked about Genesis, and you're like, when God came, it was not at all how people expected. So God comes in ways that are unfathomable to our spirit. So this is really on brand for God to do something that isn't according to our design.
right. And that's part of what the book wants to communicate. There, the suffering happens in Job, not because it's a book that wants to explore suffering. The suffering happens because that's the only way that the real question of the book can be answered. The real question of the book is, does Job serve God for nothing? That's posed by the adversary in the first chapter. Does Job serve God for nothing? And how can you tell whether Job would serve God for nothing unless you take everything away? And that's why suffering happens in the book.
Wow.
Because so it's not trying to address suffering, but suffering's the only scenario in which they can tell whether Job serves God for nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't add, you have to take away.
Yeah. So there's nothing, no theoretical conversation would have resolved that, right?
Wow.
There, it's not, you can't just say, gee, I wonder if someone would keep trusting God if they were suffering. That's not going to solve any questions. You got to
You've
take it
really
away.
you've cleared the table of the original question that I asked. So yeah, this is the point of the book. Okay, keep going. Sorry, this is just
So,
blowing my mind.
so I have these 6 keys to understanding the book
Okay.
along that line that can help us kind of clear the table to make sure that we don't have false expectations set up. Okay, so the first one is Job has trials, but he's not on trial. He thinks he's on trial because he believes in the retribution principle, but he's not. His friends think he's on trial because they believe the retribution principle, but he's not. The book makes it very clear because it declares him innocent in the first verses.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so Job has trials, but he's not on trial. Okay, secondly, the book is more about God than it is about Job. That is, it's not trying to help us understand Job better. It's trying to help us understand God better. Because the question on the table is, how do you think about God when you're suffering? Not why am I suffering, but how do you think about God?
Oh,
And
that's so good.
the
That's so
lesson
good.
of the book is not given to us by the character Job. The lesson of the book is given to us by the character God. And so this is more about God than it is about Job. But we can't call it the book of God because then all the books of the Bible would be called the book of God, and we can't do that. So it's the book of Job. But make no
Yes.
mistake, it's
Yes.
about God.
Gosh.
Okay. So that's number 2. Number 3, it's more about God's wisdom than God's justice. By the end of the book, it doesn't want us to say, oh, I understand it all now. God is fair. God is just. Because God doesn't explain his justice. He doesn't explain how it works. He doesn't explain why Job's experiences represent justice. In fact, he keeps pushing justice off to the side, like we can't talk about that. It's about his wisdom. And the key is that once you are convinced that God is wise, you can accept your circumstances. You can accept that God is just, even if you can't defend it.
Just
So,
to pause on that is when you're referencing this, because I think that this book is it's just a beautiful piece of work, to be honest. And I think one of my favorite parts is when, Job leaves his friends and then he goes and starts speaking directly to God, or God starts speaking directly to him. And I love how God just kind of corrects and checks Job when he says, like, well, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand who marked off its dimensions. Like
Yeah.
that is, it's not, he doesn't say, well, like, well, Job, this is how it works. You give and you take, and I'm the one in charge here. So you have to respect me and the decisions I make. Like explaining his just, he asks such rhetorical questions to Job of like, yeah, you're right. You did create an entire universe. Silly me for thinking that like I had a say in that one. But you're right. It is about his wisdom. And the way that he talks about his wisdom is so, I don't know, beautiful and clever. I love the way that he paints that picture for chapters. It keeps going. And that's how we kind of get to our conclusion.
Well, Job 40, verse 8 is key because there God challenges Job and he says, how dare you undermine my justice to defend your own righteousness? How dare you?
Which,
Uh,
how often do we do that?
yeah,
The verse is, would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself?
yeah. And
Yikes.
and it's interesting there that God says, how dare you undermine my justice? But he doesn't then step out and say, and this is how my justice works.
Yeah.
He
It's
just
like,
says, above your pay grade.
exactly. Yeah. And then he goes right back to what he was saying before. Do you have an arm like God's? Can your voice thunder like his?
Right.
Yeah.
So Job thinks that the ordered world, order was a high value, the ordered world ought to work by the retribution principle. And
Hmm.
what God says is, there's no way that'll work. Number one, if I gave you the crown for a day, you couldn't do it.
Mm,
Okay. Number two, there is far more order than you can possibly understand.
mm.
So how dare you reduce order to just the retribution principle?
Oh, wow. That is amazing because I think that we in our tiny human brains are like that is what governs the world, the
Yep.
karmic principle. That's what governs. And for God to be like, that's just like a tiny corner piece of the puzzle. Like you
Right.
can't
And he
even
goes through
fathom.
all those animals in chapter 39 and saying, do you know how this works? You don't understand any of this. And you think that you can, make this simple equation. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that was number three, right? That is more about God's wisdom than about his justice. And so that's the thing. If we had a full understanding of justice, we might say, okay, now I get it. I understand it all now, all the justice in the world. And then we would feel like we could kind of be on our own. But the whole idea is when we don't understand, we have to trust.
Big old blind faith comment right there.
Yeah. So that's the next one. The book is more about trusting than about answers.
I don't think people like that.
No, they don't. But because they want to get answers and they've got the questions in their mind, not the
Well, it's
questions the
also a
book.
book about wisdom, so you want the wisdom. Like,
Yeah.
explain it to me.
Yeah. But in the end, it says, you got to trust me. So I have this little story. Maybe you'll like this.
Yeah.
Okay. Lots of people think that when they get to heaven, they're going to get all the answers for everything that happened to them, the whys and the wherefores. And so I imagine this scenario in my head very creatively here. So you get to heaven and you're looking around and you see a booth over there that says answers. You say, "Oh, that's the one. That's the one." The line's long, it's worse than Disney World, but you get in line to get answers because that's one of the reasons I'm here. This is what right? And you wait for 20 years, kind of like Disney World, and you finally get to the front. You get to the front, and there's Jesus sitting in the booth, and he says, "Hello." You say, "Hi." You're real excited. You're going to get all the answers. He says, "So I've got a question to start off. Do you love me?" And you say, "Yeah, yes, of course I'm here. Yeah, of course I love you." He says, "Good, good, that's great." He said, "Another question. Do you know that I love you?" "Oh, yes. I mean, it's been something I've been grateful all my life, feeling safe and secure in your love." "Yes, yes. Good. That's great. One more. Do you trust me?" "Yes, yes, I trust you entirely." "Great. Next."
Yeah. Oh. Every morning I'm praying and I'm like, God, you know what? I surrender my life to you. I surrender this day to you. Let your will be done on earth as is in heaven. And then that, like, okay, so am I supposed to move or not? Let me know by noon.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
like,
I'm
I
on the
love
clock here.
trusting God until I got to trust God. And then I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, I actually need the answer this time.
So it's more about trusting than about answers. Okay.
Yeah.
Number five.
It's a good story, by the way. Really
Yeah,
good story.
yeah. Number five. It's the book is not about how to think about suffering, but how to think about God when you are suffering. I mentioned that one before, but let's highlight it. It's not to tell you how to think about suffering, because it doesn't explain that,
Yeah.
but it does tell you how to think about God when you're suffering.
Which, I mean, I think that Job does a really good job at the beginning. You know, even when his whole family is killed, other than his wife, he immediately praises God and just kind of like, hey, what does he say? I have it. I have it outlined because I'm just so
The Lord
amazed that
gave and
he
the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the
exactly,
Lord.
exactly, yes. What was that? 121.
Yep.
But then when he's like covered in sores and he's lost everything and he's fighting with his friends, he gets way more aggressive. And he's like, I just wish I was never born. I wish we could just skip over that day.
And I think, I mean, this isn't the lesson of the book, but I think we can observe that as Job goes further and further along, he becomes convinced that God is petty, that God just pays far too much attention to people who can never match up, and then just is ready to zap them at the slightest moment and not tell them. I mean, that God is petty. And I think that's one of the things we should learn from the book, in the sense that no, we shouldn't make that mistake of thinking that God is petty. But again, I think that's just a sideline in the book. So,
But
but we,
do you think that that was wrong for, do you think it's just a natural progression of the human condition for him to be like, ah, I'm still Christian. And then like the suffering doesn't end. So he's like, you know what, God, like, I just wish this didn't happen. Like, I actually am so upset with you. Yeah, I want to say like, was Job wrong for doing that? Because I think we all would have given up right away if our whole family died. Step number one, we would have been like, all right, I'm out of here. But
well, type A personalities obsess over details. And so the idea that we want to know every little thing that we can do to ensure our success and our favor and our blessing and prosperity,
yeah,
our flourishing, and and boy, we're going to pursue that with infinite detail. But that in itself, I mean, it's all well and good to want to do well, but to think that God demands that kind of intricate detail has the danger of thinking that God is petty. I mean,
yeah.
Job says it in ways like, won't you even look away for a moment? I mean, chapter 7 here, verse 17 and following. Won't you even look away for a moment? I don't even get a chance to swallow my spit. You're breathing down my back. Don't you have better things to do? That's my paraphrase of it. But we find the same kind of mentality even before the suffering begins. In verses 4 and 5 of chapter 1, where Job offers the sacrifices for his kids, he's
Where he
thinking,
says,
yeah, verse 4 and 5, where he's thinking, maybe my kids did something that maybe might have made God upset when they weren't thinking straight or having fun or were drunk or whatever. And so just in case, I'm going to offer these exorbitant sacrifices. He's already thinking God is petty.
interesting, because I took that verse as like, oh, Job is thorough. Like, I took that as like, he's just being a good dad. I didn't think like that was him doubting God in any way.
It's way over the top. And I think that it's not so much doubting God, but putting God in a box. And it shows up later as Job interacts with God because he treats him as if he's petty.
What do you mean by like what? Which verse are you referring to? Because I
Oh, it's
this is
all,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
it's
sorry. It's all through his conversations in the Job speeches throughout the first half of the book. Uh,
it's interesting because like at the end, like in the epilogue, it's like you have not spoken. I'm sorry. I'm angry with you and your two friends because you've not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. So at the end, God is confirming like the way Job has spoken about me was the correct way to speak about me. So it.
mm, Not quite.
Oh,
The language there's a little tricky.
Okay.
We translated spoken about me, but that verb and preposition together usually means spoken to me, which is pushes us in a different direction, but doesn't necessarily clarify, because the friends haven't spoken to God at all. So
Mm.
how can they have spoken to God what is not right about him?
Oh,
So
so you're
it's a
saying Job did the right thing by talking to God directly rather
talking
than
to
talking.
God, yeah, instead of
Mm.
making assumptions about him. Eventually, Job
Ooh.
says what is right to God. In other words, he comes around, because his first time, right, the first speech of God, Job says, okay, so I said a bunch of wrong things. I'm just going to zip it and not gonna say anything else. Okay,
What, which
just
also is like why you should pray. You shouldn't worry about it. You should pray about it.
yeah. And then his second, after the second speech, now Job is better, because now instead of just saying I'm done talking, he says, um, I was too full of myself. I need to
Yeah.
repent in dust and ashes.
Mm. Yeah.
So yeah. So number six, you ready for the last one?
I'm ready.
So number six is that the book is more about what constitutes righteousness than about why we suffer. That's the question that the book puts on the table. Does Job serve God for nothing? And by the end of the book, we are supposed to be able to answer, does Job serve God for nothing? And the answer is yes, he does. But this is not just a book about Job. And so the question is, do we serve God for nothing? Even when suffering comes into our lives, even when things disappoint us, even when everything goes wrong, do we serve God for nothing? Or are we only in it for what we get out of it?
Yikes. That is a hard truth.
But that's what the book's about. It's
Yeah.
about the nature and quality of our righteousness, not about why we suffer.
Yeah.
Suffering is just the tableau
Yeah.
on which we could at times determine whether we serve God for nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, think about what Peter says. Ah, First Peter 2:15, I'm guessing here. But it's a very popular verse. Be always ready to give defense of your faith.
3:15. Yes.
Yeah, 3:15. I was only one chapter off. Okay. We
Yeah.
often take it to talk about apologetics, but that context is not talking about apologetics. The context is talking about suffering. And the whole
What?
idea is that you should always be ready to give a defense when you are suffering, and people say, how can you still be a person of faith and a person of joy and peace when you're suffering so much? Be ready to
Oh,
give a defense.
yeah, I definitely interpreted that as like anytime you're in a room of people of non-believers, have a
Skeptics.
reason to,
Yeah.
yeah, start converting right away. What is your converting
Yeah.
script? 3, 2, 1, go. But you're
No,
saying it's more so to
sure.
kind of
Read the
defend your
context.
faith.
It's a suffering context. And so you should be because why would people want, want a defense of God? They're saying you must worship a pretty lousy God if he's letting you suffer like that. And you're ready to give a defense to say, no, I'm not serving God because he gives me all fun and bubbles and candy. I'm serving God even when things go lousy, because what else would I do?
Right.
You know? So be ready to give a defense.
Do
That's a
you feel like
suffering
you have a
verse.
defense? I feel like I've been thinking a lot about that verse now that's been brought to my attention, but this is a new lens. And I feel like my immediate answer would be like, because he puts breath in my lungs and he gave me life. Like,
Because God is God. And I don't want to be like Job and think that I can out God,
mm,
which is what lots of people do. When things go lousy, they say, oh, God, you're doing a lousy job. I could do better than this.
ugh,
Look
oh,
at all this suffering in the world. Sheesh, can't you do better than that? Right? They think they can out God.
yeah,
And that
yeah,
goes back to Job 40, verse 8. How dare you? How dare you?
yeah. That commonly comes up whenever I feel like the apologetics for my faith are, well, why does God let bad things happen to good people? Why does he let children die and innocent people die in a fire and, go to war? It's like, who are you to try to think I can explain
I
God's
can't explain
reasoning?
it, but I trust God's wisdom.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a mind shift. Oh my gosh. This is going to be sinking in my skin for all like the whole week. This is so much wisdom. I'm definitely going to write it down and meditate more on it. So thanks for sharing that. I have a question about the friends.
Go ahead.
Do you feel like the friends are kind of representing the people that you have to pose that testimony to? Like the three friends are the human condition. They're representing the people that are trying to encourage you to out God.
I think they are, I guess I would call them archetypal. They represent different kinds of thinking.
Mm,
Um, the friends' arguments, even though they seem to overlap quite a bit, when you really sort them out, each friend represents a particular perspective, and each speech that they give opens up a important topic. In my commentary on Job, I went through that in each speech to say, what's going on with that. So I do think they represent something symbolic.
yeah, when you read it, it just seems like they're all saying the same thing is like, God is just, so you must have done something wrong for this to
Mhm.
happen. But what are the nuances between each stance?
Yeah. Again, it's fairly, um, it gets into deep weeds in philosophy
Oh, okay.
to talk about them. So I don't know that that would be productive right here, but
Okay.
it can be sorted out on that basis. But they do all share a certain common denominator, and that is that they all believe that the retribution principle is true and that God is just and that therefore Job is the problem.
Yeah. Yeah,
They all they
definitely
all agree with that.
that's definitely how it seems. Um, okay. Um,
I think one important thing for us to talk about, if I can, um,
absolutely.
you know, how does the book deliver its message? Again, it's not the character of Job who delivers the message. Job is wrong. He's not as wrong as the other friends, but he's wrong about how he's thinking about God. He's right to be righteous and to maintain his righteousness, but he's wrong in the way he thinks about God. So we shouldn't be getting the lessons of the book from Job's speeches. We get the lessons of the book from God's speeches, which makes sense that we would do so. And of course, he rebukes Job so that we know that they're not both on the same page, but we get the message from God's speeches. We've talked a lot about the first speech where he talks about, can you direct the flood and do you understand the animals and all of that. But that speech only gets you so far. That speech gets you as far as Job gets. Zip. Okay, you trumped me. I don't understand this stuff, and so I'm just going to stop talking. But that's not enough. The lesson of the book is not just shut up. I'm God, you're not. Get lost.
Right.
That's not the message of the book. That's what might happen if you stopped after God's first speech. It's God's second speech, which leads Job to his repentance. That's got to be seen as the key. And the second speech is all about these two weird creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, right?
Yeah, what the heck was that?
Exactly. That's what everybody says when they read the book.
It's a
Like,
weird turn in the
okay,
conversation.
whoa, we're in fantasy land now. I'm done. Let's get all the elves and the dwarves together and go off to Fairhaven. I'm just right,
I was
right.
on board until we started talking about dinosaurs and Job, and then I
Yeah,
logged off.
exactly. So, but but that's the second speech, which is the climax of the book, and it drives Job to his response. So they're
Oh,
really, really important.
okay. Why is it
So,
more important? What's the separate point that he makes? Because to
ex-
me, it sounded like an extension of, do you understand how trees work and the sky works and how this works? Do you understand animals and this animal and this other animal? So
but
what's
it
the
goes
difference?
beyond that because again, it's broken out as a second speech. It's not just a tag on to the end of the first speech. It's a second speech, and again has a different response from Job. Furthermore, we now find that with both of those creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, God compares them to Job. And that means something. Something is supposed to come out of that. So What's the lesson of these two? I call them chaos creatures because that's what they are. They're chaos creatures in the ancient world. So we just shouldn't think dinosaurs. We shouldn't think hippopotamus or crocodile. We shouldn't, they are chaos creatures, and that's a thing in the ancient world. They
Interesting.
understand chaos creatures. They get the idea.
Is a
Um,
chaos creature kind of like the like enemy, like the bad guy in a story?
Not necessarily. Sometimes they're foils. Sometimes they what would I say? They um, they are ones that we would pity or sympathize with, things of that sort.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different possibilities with that. Um, the but when we talk about them, they're creatures that are outside the ordered realm.
Oh.
Okay, Joe's been seeking order.
Oh.
God's going to give him lessons from the non-ordered realm. Okay, so Behemoth is the first one, and we shouldn't even bother thinking about what kind of creatures these are. You know, um, some people suggest hippopotamus for Behemoth because he's in the reeds of the river and things, but it talks about his tail like a cedar tree. That is not an hippopotamus. Anyway, um, so
Okay.
and Leviathan, he's not a crocodile. He breathes fire. Crocodiles don't breathe fire, nor do dinosaurs, for that matter. Okay, so these are chaos creatures. They're known quantities in the ancient world. They're from the realm of non-order.
So he's
So
speaking to him the way that people were speaking back then. He's not making up stuff
no,
or
they would
referencing an ancient creature. This is just how they spoke to each other by
they would
referencing these
absolutely know what he
characters.
was talking about. Right?
Okay.
Leviathan occurs many other times in Scripture, besides here, and outside of Scripture in other ancient Near Eastern literature. So
Mm.
Behemoth. The point is, God says, I made Behemoth just like you. And so he draws the two together. And the point about Behemoth is that Behemoth stands stable and strong and sturdy in rushing waters. And that's a metaphor. Job learned the lesson of Behemoth. Stand sturdy and strong and stable in rushing waters, the rushing waters of life that threaten to sweep you away. Even Behemoth in the world of non-order can reflect that. Job, sometimes you feel like you're in a non-ordered world when life is rushing around you and sweeping you away. Stand firm, stand strong. That's Behemoth. Leviathan does not represent evil. And the text here in Job never talks about that God has defeated him. Other texts talk about that, but we can't drag them in here. Leviathan is the fiercest creature that they can imagine. And the point that the text keeps making is you cannot defeat Leviathan. You cannot domesticate Leviathan. You cannot tame Leviathan. And I am greater than Leviathan. Why do you think you can tame me? Why do you think you can domesticate me and fit me into your little boxes?
Mm. Wow. Just taking notes as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
This is
So
amazing.
the lesson of Behemoth, stand strong in raging waters. Lesson of Leviathan, don't think you can tame God and make him march to your tune.
Wow. Uh, what do you think's like a modern day version of that? Because when you started talking, I was like, oh, I'm thinking of like the movie Hercules, like those poor creatures that Hercules keeps kind of overcoming. But obviously, very different context here. Now that you've explained it,
Mm-hmm.
um, obviously, the way that he posed this had such an impact on Job that it humbled him to repent and ask for forgiveness. Do you think there's a version of that today, as far as like what do we think is the strongest creature that we could never overcome? And then when we realize God can overcome it, we're like, oh yeah, God is mighty.
Well, it's not even so much that God can overcome it. It's that you realize that this creature is beyond your ability to, again, tame or conquer, and yet you somehow think that you can tame God and make him march to your tune. You can't do it.
That is
That's the
such a difficult thought to
that's a
swallow.
point of comparison. But that's exactly what Job's inclination was and what many of our inclinations are, and it's what Job had to repent of. He had to repent of the fact that he was trying to squeeze God into his box of expectations,
Hmm.
and that God had to work in this way and that way and the other way. You can't do that to God.
Ah, yeah. Really goes back to that expectations we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
I can understand why people with those expectations and having that become unanswered, they leave this book with just more questions than answers.
And that's because the book isn't designed to give the answers to the questions they're asking. Again, the question the book wants you to ask is, do I serve God for nothing? And if you think you can tame God to your own desires and expectations, then you're not serving God for nothing. You're putting him into a box that's going to serve your purposes. That's not what God's for. It's not how God works,
Yeah, my purposes aren't God's purposes. God has his own purposes that I have to trust and have faith
right?
in and lean on the wisdom of that rather than expect an explanation for.
God doesn't
Oh my
have to
gosh.
explain himself.
This is all happening to Job for the first time. So I can have sympathy for his friends who are like, hey, this is the way it's always been. And Job is standing very firm in the trust and love and faith in God. So that is speaking quite highly of him experiencing it for the first time, whereas we struggle with it today and we have a book outlining it.
Right. And you can see that even more so that, okay, Messiah is a Jewish concept that's built into the covenant. And Job not only doesn't have any messianic ideas, he doesn't have any covenant ideas. That's the whole point of him being from the land of Uz. We don't have to
Mm,
know where it is. We just know it's outside of Israel. So nothing in
mm.
the book puts him in a covenant context. And so not only is he trusting God without idea of a Messiah, he's trusting God without the idea of a covenant.
That just added a whole nother layer to this.
Yeah, it does. But here's the interesting part. In both my books, I talk about even though Job is very explicitly portrayed as non-Israelite and as an outsider, so that there's no covenant, no monotheism, nothing that's Israelite in Job's profile. But he thinks like an Israelite, which they can't avoid. They just couldn't, So, for instance, he says in his oath in chapter 31, he more or less says, I've never lifted up my hands to the moon or sun in worship. Hello, that's only an Israelite who would think that was a good thing. Everybody else in the world would think, of course, you lift your hands up to the sun and the moon. What else would you do? That's proper worship. Only an Israelite would say, no, I don't do that. So,
Because that's like a pagan thing? So
yeah,
only in it.
exactly.
Oh, oh.
Right.
Okay, so
So,
this was
so
probably
even
written
though,
by an Israelite.
yeah, even though Job is portrayed as non-Israelite, this is written by Israelites to Israelites.
Mm.
And all these kind of Israelite things sneak in here. I've got a whole
Yeah.
section of that in my books that kind of open that up. It's
Oh.
kind of interesting.
The faith that he had and the humility and the trust in God. I mean, at the beginning of this chapter, and the fact that he didn't even have an exposure to the covenant and the Israelite thinking and the Israelite way of life and their belief system or a Messiah. Like, oh my gosh, we have all of those at our fingertips, and yet we still struggle worse
Right.
than Job.
And that also weighs into that very familiar verse in Job 19:25 where he says, I know that my Redeemer lives. Because that's very clearly not talking about Jesus or the Messiah or anything of that sort. Job is portrayed as a non-Israelite. Um, what he's saying there, okay, Job is expecting
You
that
said Job 19:5?
1925. Sorry.
25. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
Handel wrote a whole song about it in The Messiah, okay? But it is not about Messiah at all. What you have there, right? I know that my Redeemer lives. A Redeemer, that Hebrew word, okay, is someone who vindicates someone in their family, usually, who has been falsely accused. Okay, so the redeemer in the family would be if you get in legal trouble, you've been falsely accused, you've been hauled into court, you've been, right? The redeemer is the one who's going to get you free of that to prove that you didn't do it, that you're innocent. And that's what Job wants. Somebody who's going to prove him innocent. That's exactly the opposite of what Jesus does. Jesus does not prove us innocent. He does not vindicate us. He redeems us from all the things that we actually have done wrong. So it's totally the opposite side of the coin from what Jesus does. And when Handel wrote his Messiah, or when we talk about that verse in church and we talk about Jesus, we're going exactly the opposite direction from what Job is looking for.
Job's looking for someone to say, see, he is innocent. Look.
Yep.
And Jesus is
Yep.
like, they're not innocent, but
No.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I got
they
this.
don't stand a
Right.
chance.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. This is amazing. That's like, okay, so logistically, what was Job waiting on then? He was waiting on someone to see through and see what he was seeing, that like, no, see, I am innocent. Someone else vouch for me. Like, why would
Well,
he mention that if he was so alone in this thought and his friends weren't seeing it?
well, that's the thing. Who is he expecting that might be able to do this? Often it was a family member, but his immediate family is dead.
Mm,
And, we don't see him referring to other family members. Some
mm,
think that maybe he was thinking that someone in the heavenlies, in the heavenly
mm.
council, the divine assembly, would step up and say, God, you're doing wrong by that man. And we don't know what he's thinking, but he assumes that it's going to happen before he dies. And that's in that same passage in verses 26 and 27. While I'm
Very
still
interesting.
in the flesh, it's going to happen. So
I see.
difficult to translate right there.
A little bit of a sidebar, but where's Job's wife? Because she doesn't die.
No, she doesn't. She
She
doesn't.
doesn't die, and then he's like, "Oh, my family has cast me aside." But then once he gets rich again, they're like, "Oh, we can't get back for the feast."
Yeah.
So,
Well, the only words she has to say are pretty harsh. You know,
yeah,
give it up, Job. Just curse God and let him stand out in the middle of the field in a lightning storm and let him take you. Yeah. So, uh, so yeah. But again, that's okay. So we talked about the question about did Job really exist? Again, that's really not the important question here because the book is set up as a thought experiment. Imagine this scenario. It's a thought experiment. Imagine this scenario, and maybe the scenario is built around somebody that they knew of from of old. Fine, okay, but it's still a built scenario. Imagine this. So, even with the wife's statements and the friend's statements, so imagine this that what somebody says this, the wife responds this way, the friends respond this way. Um, how would Job respond to those? In that sense, it's somewhat like how we read the parables. Parable is one form of thought experiment. It's not the only form, but it's one form. And with the parables, it's sort of imagine this. Imagine there's this man who gets beat up on the path, and so it's that kind of idea, and that's how wisdom literature works. Imagine this scenario, and so in that case, we shouldn't be harsh on Job's wife. She's just a part of the thought experiment. Give her a break. But likewise, and here's where this really becomes important: the scene in heaven at the beginning is part of the thought experiment. Don't derive your knowledge of God from what you read in those first two chapters. Oh,
between
yeah,
him and
God
Satan.
regularly has these council things and talks about people. Probably my name came up last week and that's why I'm suffering. No, 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 no. This is not trying to describe how God really works. Okay? So Uh, And that's important because people get stuck right in those first two chapters and say, "Wow, is this how God runs the world?" Seems kind of rough, you know. Yeah,
How could we know?
it's part of the thought experiment.
That's a good point. Yeah, it does paint a picture where we're like, oh, so that's how the meetings work in heaven. Satan
Yeah,
just pops in from roaming the earth and
yeah,
just starts, you know, pitching ideas to God.
yeah. Well, no, that's not how it works.
That is really interesting. I do think one person that we forgot to talk about that I'm going to sneak in last minute is Elihu.
Hmm.
And I think that although he is one of the friends and he does kind of live within that karmic retribution principle, he does say like, do not blame God for Job's suffering. That was one of the hills that he kept staying on. What are your thoughts on Elihu and how he's different from those three friends?
Yeah. On In the human characters in the book, he's more right than anyone, including Job.
Oh,
Okay, that's why he comes in at a different time. He really has a very different perspective than the three friends. In some of my material, I use a triangle. And the triangle has the retribution principle in one corner, Job's righteousness in another corner, and God's justice at the top. And those things are all work together fine when Job's life is going well. Job is righteous, God is just, retribution principle is maintained, everything's good. But when Job begins suffering, now something's got to give. Now you've got some cognitive dissonance here, and something's got to give. And so what I say is Job's three friends, you know, when the triangle starts to collapse, you've got to figure out which angle you're going to defend and which of the other two you're going to deny. So the friends, they build their fort, so to speak. They defend the retribution principle. So they look out at the other two corners, Job's righteousness, God's justice. And they say, well, we believe God is just. And so, sorry, Job, you were our friend, but you're the weak link here. You're off the island. Yeah, it's your righteousness that's under question. Okay, so that's where they build a fort. Job, of course, very clearly builds his fort in the corner of his own righteousness. He says, "This I know. I'm righteous. I don't deserve all of this." He looks out at the other two corners. He says, "Okay, retribution principle or God's justice." And he keeps trying to find a hole in the retribution principle, and he can't do it. And that leaves him in the very awkward position of challenging God's justice, or at least calling God to come and defend himself. For crying out loud, you've got a responsibility here. So Job builds his fort in his righteousness. He ends up challenging God's justice. Elihu, different from both of them, builds his fort up on God's justice. That's to his credit. Okay, so now he's got to look at the other two, retribution principle and Job's righteousness. To which one are you going to give up? You've got to give up something here. Okay, and what he does in all the best and honest ways, he cheats. He cheats because he does some redefining. He redefines the retribution principle, not just as consequences, penalties, punishments, rewards of what you've done in the past, but rather that retribution principle can anticipate things you'll goof up in the future and try to head you off at the pass. Stop it before it happens. That's an expansive idea of retribution principle. But then that allows him to turn to Job and say, okay, Job, so your problem is not something you did in the past, contrary to those three other clowns and what they're saying. Your problem is not what you did in the past. You had a clean record. Your problem is showing up now in how you're responding now. Your self-righteousness is your problem. So he redefines retribution principle to cover future responses, and then identifies Job's future response, his self-righteousness, as the problem for which he's. So it's really an interesting, it's a complicated kind of approach, but that's why Elihu's different. Elihu builds his fort in a different place, and Elihu does not capitulate to just the simple aspects of the triangle.
Wow. Elihu with the most wisdom.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
It's always the subtle characters in the
yeah.
Bible that you're like,
Uh,
oh,
Put a
where'd they come
poster of
from?
him on your wall, right next to Leviathan, by the way. Anyway,
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah. That was a lot. And well deserved. This is a very complicated book, but you've shed some very true light on it. Any final thoughts on Job? Do you think we missed any like key topics that we can't move on without?
I think we've covered them. And again, I would come back to the basic, what is the question of the book? Do we serve God for nothing?
Wow.
And I
I,
think that's what we have to walk away from the book thinking. That's not going to solve your conundrum about suffering or anything of that sort. But it's the real question. It's the same
yeah.
question that Abraham had to prove when God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac. The
Yeah.
same question. Do you serve God for nothing? It's not there in the text, but it's implied in the text because Abraham is asked to give up everything. That's not just his son on the altar. That is the covenant on the altar. Without Isaac, there's no covenant. There's no family, there's no blessing, there's no land without Isaac. It's not just his son he's putting on the altar. Abraham, would you serve me for nothing? If there was no promise, if there was no covenant, if there was no land or family, would you serve me anyway? Pretty tough question.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people assign cruelty to God when they see these things of hurting Job, asking Abraham to do such a horrible thing. They're like, well, God must not be that great because he was able to ask somebody to do that. And you're right, it's not that God was doing something horrible. God was just asking, do you serve me even amidst the bad?
Do you trust me?
Oh
Do you
my
trust me?
gosh. Oh my gosh. Wow, that really puts a new lens on like all the quote unquote bad things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you trust me? It's not because God doesn't love us, it's because he does.
Yep. Next.
Perfect conclusion. Oh my gosh. Well, I know that we scraped the surface on all the work you've done on Job, but how can people who are listening, you've written commentaries, you did a whole book, you've done education, where can we access all of this? Is there
Yeah.
a YouTube channel? Is there, can you, I'll send links, I'll put them in the show notes
Mhm.
for your books.
Well, the great place is those 30 lectures on biblical e-learning, which I think you've already
Is that on,
looked at.
I think I might have already linked that in the last show, but I'll link it also in this
Yeah.
one because that's on
So that's
Amazon.
the easiest to access. Then if you prefer books to those kinds of things, this one's the easiest to get into, How to Read Job. And Trumper Longman and I did it together. And it's just a little paperback. It's easy to get into. And
Okay.
that'll give some of that as well.
And then any like YouTube channels that you run, where can we access some lectures?
No, yeah, you just have to. I don't run my own channel, but I'm all over YouTube when I speak at different places and they record me. And so,
Got it.
yeah.
Got it. Do you have like a favorite lecture that you've spoken on Job at like a school that you're like, that one, I killed it?
It's probably the 30 lectures on biblically learning
Okay.
that would do it. Yeah.
Okay. Any other work coming up that you want to plug or promote?
Oh, well, lots of things. So, two books that just came out recently. One is called Wisdom for Faithful Reading, which we might have talked about last time. And another one's called The Lost World of the Prophets, which just came out a couple months ago,
Oh,
and talks about how to understand prophecy better in
oh,
light of its ancient context. I've got a 2-volume commentary on Daniel that's coming out, um,
wow.
about
We love Daniel.
about 1,800 pages of commentary. So that's on its way out. I'm writing a new book called New Explorations in the Lost World of Genesis, where I'm bringing the whole conversation up to date after 15 years of lecturing on it on the road and things. And I'm currently writing a book called The Crisis of Biblical Authority, which is a lot of fun.
When do you eat or like sleep?
Got my microwave right here on the other side of the computer screen. It's the refrigerator down here to the left.
Wow, that is a lot of wisdom. Oh, gosh, you're such a resource. Thank you so much for imparting that and sharing this. I mean, you've added so many new levels to a book that I couldn't understand, and now I feel like, and it's transformative. So thank you so much for this. I really appreciate your time. I know that you're busy, and I'm sorry I was an hour late to our call today, but thanks for being flexible.
So I'm glad you found it helpful. I hope the listeners will also be motivated, prompted to look more deeply into these books.
Well, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to connecting again soon. I already have a couple ideas that I'll be contacting you about, so I hope we can find another time soon.
Okay. Good to
Thank
talk
you
to you,
so
Kelsey.
much. Bye.